Hello everybody, this is another chess video on Master Games, and this game was played between Rubinstein and Marshall. Rubinstein was white. This game is from 1908, and without further ado, Rubinstein started with d4. Black played d5, knight f3, c6. Now, this is a very solid positional line that Marshall's playing here. The Slav generally is seen as very drawish and not very exciting, but white does have several options here, and Rubinstein chose to play fairly actively with c4, e6, e3. So going for a solid pawn structure, but having a slight tension in the centre. There's always the option of c takes d5. And here Marshall played bishop d6. So his bishop is a key figure here. It's very useful in guarding all the dark squares, while his pawns guard the light squares. And Rubinstein then played knight c3, developing a new piece. f5 was now played. So this is now transposing to a kind of stonewall Dutch, where black effectively puts a lot of pawns on light squares and just tries to clamp down as much as he possibly can on the light squares, and then just bear the pressure on the dark squares. And because everything's so closed up, it's very hard for white to break through a lot of the time. So Rubinstein here played knight e5, just trying to cement a knight onto the e5 square. Normally the plan would be to next play f4, and then if black were to take on e5, recapture with the f-pawn, having more pawns in the centre, and also a semi-open f-file. Possibly if you were to castle kingside, the rook on f1 might be useful later. But Marshall immediately took. White took, giving himself doubled pawns, but his d4 pawn going to e5 does limit the black's knight on g8, stops it going to its favourite square of f6. So knight h6 was played instead. f4 was played to protect e5 and to try and keep the pressure on. Castles. Bishop e2, b6, and castles. So here, the modern plan for black is to try and exchange off his bishop for white's bishop, because as his pawns are on light squares in the centre, his bishop on c8 is going to have a very hard time really doing much. The other plan is to move it to d7, then e8, and then h5 usually. But I think here that wouldn't be a very effective plan, because the e2 bishop would just be stopping the black bishop moving there. So here what I would have played would be bishop a6, just targeting c4 and ready to swap off at a moment's notice. And I'm not really sure white can do a lot to really prevent this. But in the game, Marshall chose to play bishop b7. White then protected his pawn with b3, making a pawn chain. And there's also another plan that white had here. Can you guess what white played after knight a6? Well, b3 wasn't just to protect the pawn. What it did was it facilitated the move bishop a3. seizing the diagonal and attacking the rook on f8. Now, if black were to block with c5, white could just take on d5, black would recapture, and if he wanted, he could win a pawn with knight takes, bishop takes, and then bishop takes the loose knight over here. So c5 wouldn't have been a very good move. So instead, what black played was rook f7, and now, how did white improve one of his pieces? How did he make one of his pieces go to a better square? Well, the common theme of knight e5, as seen earlier, is to control and have influence over lots of squares in black's camp. And the pawn on e5 does the same thing, although it's not as effective as a knight on e5. But here, the one square it's controlling completely is d6. So Rubinstein played bishop d6, and now his bishop's practically immovable there, and it's cutting down black's safe squares that he can move his pieces to. So it has a real cramping influence, and it's taking control of a weak square. So here, black played rook d7, partly to allow him to play knight f7 next move and then be able to take the bishop. But first, white played b4, knight f7 was played, but here c takes d5 was played first, and if black takes the bishop, white can interpose and take the pawn on e6, for example, winning a pawn. And after the rook would move, white could then capture on d6, and it might be rather unpleasant for black. So black recaptured, but he recaptured with the e-pawn, which is not something I like here. I would have recaptured with the c-pawn. Now, the reason for that will be explained shortly, but just to show that it isn't as bad for black as in the game, after c takes, capturing towards the centre, white could keep a small advantage with b5. The knight would then probably move to c5. Then I could take if I wished. And here I would have a small advantage with white, but if I was playing black, I wouldn't feel too uncomfortable with this position. Maybe here it's close to even. I could sack the pawn on c5 to get some activity if I wished. I could play queen a5. I could play queen e7 or f8 if I wished to protect the pawn more. So, or rook dc7. So I don't feel this is so bad for black. But in the game, black, as I said, took with the e-pawn, and I don't like that because partly it's not capturing towards the centre, which is what you're always told, but later on, the pawn on e5 could be a very strong endgame feature. It could be just winning for white just with the e-pawn because it's a passed pawn that's being protected. So white could keep this pawn all the way to the endgame and then use it to maybe distract the black king or prevent the black king moving too far away, and then white might be able to win on another side of the board or another area of the board. There are many other reasons why it's potentially could win being a protected passer as well, but I'd be very uncomfortable with black here, especially because there is a minority attack that white can now do. Even though black has 4 pawns on the queen side and white has 2 pawns on the queen side, he can wreck black's structure with a well-timed b5. And here, if the pawns are exchanged, black would take, and then white could play bishop takes b5, hitting the rook and winning the exchange. So black instead plays knight c7, and now takes, and black has an isolated queen's pawn. So even though he's got 2 against 1 on the queen side, on a7 and b6 against a2, white's pawn structure, even though he has double pawns, is superior because the pawn on e5 is a useful attacker and protector of the bishop, and the pawn on d5 is just a target. So here white played bishop takes knight, rook takes knight, and then bishop f3. So the pawn on d5 has now certainly become a target. White is concentrating all his pieces on the d5 pawn. And even though he's not blockading on d4, he may as well be, because he's got the pawn on e3 and the queen on d1 sufficiently protecting that square. So as long as you don't allow the isolated queen's pawn to advance, keep it where it is, just keep attacking it as well, you've generally got very good play. And white is attacking with 3 pieces on d5, and black only has 2 defenders. So can anyone see why rook d7 would not be a good move, adding a 3rd defender to d5? Yes, if rook d7, then e6 just forks the rook and knight, and winning a piece or a pawn is resignable here if black had got himself into this position. So that was not played. Instead, king h8 was played, just perhaps getting the king off the same diagonal as his queen's pawn, perhaps thinking that white might have a bishop on d5 at some point and not wanting to be pinned or forked or anything else. So he lets go of the pawn, knight takes d5, and here rook d7 is played. So the same idea is played as before, e6, and this is very, very uncomfortable for black. It's practically lost already. This wasn't played in the game, but I think my best chance would be rook takes d5, bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop takes, and white will want to exchange queens and then exchange rooks. So this is pretty horrible. Black can temporarily win a pawn, but it's not going to do a lot of good. Black should lose this game, but may be able to put up a fight for quite a while longer. It can be surprisingly difficult to win this, because black could make white's life very, very difficult. And try and play 3 pawns against 4 on the king side, and keep a protected pawn from the bishop on g8. So, for example, in this position, while it is 1 for white, it will take a lot of effort to win this. It might be another 30 or 40 moves before white can make his exchange actually show in this position. So again, black is technically lost, but it would have been a much longer, bitter grind than the actual game. What happened was, instead of rook takes d5, rook d6 was played, white took the knight, black took, white took, and here I think Marshall realised that rook takes d5 would not be a very good move. Can anyone see why rook takes d5 wouldn't be that good? Yes, white can do a nasty, what's called deflection, or overloading, I believe, I think this is more of a deflection. The queen on d8 is protecting the rook on d5, so white simply makes the queen move away by promoting to a rook or a queen with check. Black has to take, and now white gets a free rook. And again, this is just game over. A rook down, you're not going to survive very long. So here, Marshall tried to remedy this with queen d7. And the game was very quickly ended by Rubinstein. What would you play here as white? Yeah, for those keen-eyed amongst you, bishop takes rook. Doesn't matter about our queen, because after rook takes queen, what Rubinstein did, but I wouldn't have done, is he promoted to a queen with mate. I'd have promoted to a rook with mate, just to have the very rare sight of there being 3 white rooks on the board. Then again, that's just a strange sense of humour on my part. But I thought this was a very, very interesting game, and it really showed that Rubinstein's understanding of positional chess was phenomenal. He was able to quickly use the position to his advantage and to use the positional advantages in his favour, while Marshall was not showing a full understanding of the position. As earlier, bishop a6 to swap off his bad bishop for white's good bishop would have been a very good idea, and him not being able to prevent white infiltrating into black's half of the board due to the weakness on the dark squares was really was shown to be one of the key things that lost him the match. I think the main mistake, to be honest, was if we go back to the beginning of the game, here, in this position, Marshall took the knight, and as I said at the time, the bishop is needed to protect all those dark squares and have influence over the dark squares. Without the black bishop, the dark squares are instantly made very, very weak, and so it's almost as though black has lost control over a lot of squares in his half of the board already, and it's not even moved 10 yet. And from here, as you saw, white can just use the advantage of the dark squares to create a winning advantage. So I hope you liked the video. Comment, subscribe, leave any thoughts that you might have on it, and see you soon.